Daniel Whitmore had learned long ago that the loudest rooms are often the emptiest ones. He sat in the corner of the banquet hall, nursing a glass of water, not wine, just water, watching his son hold court at the center of the room like a king who had forgotten where his kingdom came from. Marcus was laughing that laugh, the one that filled every corner of every room he entered, the one that made strangers feel like they were witnessing something important. Daniel used to love that laugh. Now it sounded like a door slamming in a house he once owned. The occasion was Marcus's 40th birthday party, 200 guests, a Michelin-starred catering team, a jazz quartet in the corner that Marcus had flown in from New Orleans because, as he had told his wife Priya loudly enough for Daniel to hear, nothing less than the best, babe, nothing less. Daniel had been seated at table 14, not table 1, where Marcus held court with his business partners and their glittering wives, not table 2, where Priya's parents sat in positions of honor with champagne flutes that never seemed to empty. Table 14 was near the kitchen. Daniel could feel the warm breath of the ovens every time the door swung open. He didn't mind. He had eaten in worse places. He had eaten standing up over a sink in a studio apartment 38 years ago, counting quarters to figure out if he could afford a second can of soup. He did not complain about table 14, he simply watched. His grandson Oliver found him first, as he always did. Oliver was 12 and possessed the rare quality of seeing people rather than projecting onto them. He slid into the empty chair beside Daniel and loosened his clip-on tie with the practiced relief of someone who had been waiting to do that all evening. "Grandpa, why are you sitting all the way over here?" "I like the view," Daniel said. Oliver looked around. The view was largely of a swinging kitchen door and a tray of used champagne flutes. He looked back at his grandfather with the unimpressed expression that only children can truly pull off. "Dad put you here, didn't he?" It wasn't a question. Daniel smiled and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Oliver leaned his head against Daniel's shoulder the way he had since he was 3 years old, and Daniel felt something in his chest loosen, some knot that had been tightening all evening, since Marcus had greeted him at the door with a handshake instead of a hug, and said, "Dad, you made it," in the tone of a man surprised that the postal service had delivered something fragile without breaking it. Daniel had driven 2 hours for that handshake. He had worn his best suit, which was 14 years old but well kept, because Daniel Whitmore believed that you take care of the things that matter, no matter how long you've had them. Marcus had looked at that suit the way people look at a car parked slightly crooked, not a crisis, but a minor embarrassment. "Is your dad happy tonight?" Daniel asked Oliver. Oliver considered this with unusual seriousness. "He's performing happy," he said finally. "That's different." Daniel looked at his grandson with something close to wonder. 12 years old, he thought. 12 years old and already wiser than the room. The moment that changed everything happened just after 10 o'clock. Marcus had gathered a circle of his closest business associates near the bar, the kind of men who wore watches worth more than Daniel's first car, who spoke in the shorthand of people accustomed to being listened to. Daniel had drifted closer, not to eavesdrop but simply because the night had grown long and the kitchen door was beginning to wear on him, and he wanted to see his son's face from the front rather than the side. He was standing at the edge of the circle when he heard it. "My father, yeah, he's here somewhere." Marcus laughed, waving a hand vaguely in the direction of table 14. "Sweet old man, lives very simply. We try to help out when we can, you know how it is. He was never great with money." One of the associates, a broad man named Fletcher with a jaw like a ship's prow, nodded sagely. "Tough generation, didn't know how to build wealth." "Exactly," Marcus said. "He worked his whole life and just never accumulated anything, you know, humble circumstances." He said it with a kind of tender condescension, the tone of a man who has rewritten his own origin story so many times he no longer recognizes the original draft. But he's comfortable. We make sure he's comfortable. Daniel stood very still. He thought about the hardware store on Clement Street that he had opened at 26 with $11,000 he had saved over 4 years of double shifts. He thought about the second location he had opened 8 years later, and the third after that. He thought about the land he had bought quietly in 3 different counties over the course of 2 decades, because he believed in things you could touch, things you could stand on. He thought about the storage facility on the edge of town, where 4 cars sat under cloth covers, the cars he had collected not as trophies, but as time capsules, each one marking a year when something had shifted, when the work had paid off in some new and specific way. He thought about his will, which Marcus had never asked about, because Marcus, he now understood fully, had never imagined there was anything to ask about. He had been standing at the edge of that circle for perhaps 30 seconds. It felt like 30 years. He walked quietly back to table 14, sat down, and finished his glass of water. It was Oliver who suggested the cars. The next morning, Daniel was in the driveway of Marcus's house. He had stayed the night at a nearby hotel, not wanting to impose, when his grandson came bounding out in pajamas and sneakers, the urgency of youth propelling him forward at a speed that seemed to defy the earliness of the hour. "Grandpa, you said one day you'd show me the garage." Daniel looked at him. He had mentioned the storage facility exactly once 8 months ago, in passing, while Oliver had been half absorbed in a video game. He had said something like, "I've got a few old cars I keep in a place outside town." He had said it the way he said most things about his life, plainly, without adornment, the way you describe furniture. Oliver had apparently filed this information in the same drawer as everything else his grandfather said, which was to say, carefully for later use. "Does your father know you're out here?" "He's asleep. Mom said I could come say goodbye to you." Daniel considered the morning. The air was clean after last night's performance. He looked at his grandson's face, open, curious, completely without agenda, and made a decision. "Get some proper shoes," he said, "and tell your mother where we're going." The storage facility was 20 minutes outside the city. A low beige building set back from a 2-lane road, surrounded by the particular quiet of places that don't need to announce themselves. The manager, a retired mechanic named Saul who had known Daniel for 11 years, looked up from behind his desk and nodded the way you nod at someone whose habits you understand. "Bay 4, Saul said. "I had them started up last week like you asked." Daniel thanked him and led Oliver down the corridor. Oliver was quiet in the way children are quiet when they sense they are approaching something real. Daniel unlocked the bay. The door rolled upwards slowly, and the morning light entered the space like something being gradually revealed, which, in a way, it was. There were 4 cars. Each one rested under a fitted cloth cover, grey and smooth, like sleeping animals. The bay smelled of oil and clean leather, and the particular stillness of valuable things at rest. Daniel walked to the first cover and pulled it back in one motion. A 1967 Mercedes-Benz 280 SL emerged into the light cream white, chrome catching the morning like a collection of small suns. Daniel had bought it 22 years ago from an estate sale. He had paid a reasonable price because he had known what it was, and the seller had not, which was one of the quiet advantages of spending your life learning things that other people couldn't be bothered to learn. Oliver made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Daniel moved to the second cover, a 1971 Ferrari 365 GTB4, the Daytona, in a red so deep it looked like it contained its own light source. He had acquired this one through a collector in Florence who had run into unexpected tax difficulties. They had corresponded for 6 months before the price became reasonable. The third, a 1963 Aston Martin DB5, silver, the one that needed no explanation, the one that existed in the imagination of every person alive who had ever watched a certain kind of film on a certain kind of night. Daniel had bought this one for himself, specifically for himself, on the day he had paid off every debt he had ever owed to every person and institution in his life. He had driven it once around the block of the storage facility, and then he had covered it, and that had been enough. The fourth was different from the others, not a classic in the conventional sense, but a modern monument, a Bugatti Chiron in midnight blue, one of a limited production run. Daniel had purchased it 3 years ago on what he privately considered a moment of uncharacteristic whimsy. He was 71 years old. He had decided he was allowed one moment of uncharacteristic whimsy. Oliver stood in the center of all 4 cars and turned slowly, like a compass finding north. "Grandpa," he said, his voice was hushed. "These are cars," Daniel said. "They're just cars." "They are not just cars." "No," Daniel admitted, "they're not." He hadn't planned for Marcus to appear. But Marcus had woken to find his son gone, had gotten the destination from Priya, and had driven out with the particular urgency of a man who doesn't fully understand why he's alarmed, but is alarmed nonetheless. He walked through the facility door and down the corridor and into Bay 4, still wearing the clothes from the night before, the expensive jacket wrinkled now, the tie gone. He stopped in the doorway. The 4 cars stood in the morning light. His father stood beside the Aston Martin with his hand resting lightly on the hood. Oliver sat on the floor cross-legged in front of the Ferrari, examining it with the focused reverence of a person in a museum. Marcus's mouth opened, nothing came out. Daniel watched his son's face do something complicated, cycle through expressions that had nowhere to land, like a man flipping through a book in a language he doesn't speak. Surprise first, then confusion, then something that looked for just a moment almost like wonder, and then underneath all of that, working its way up slowly like a thing that has been buried and is now reluctantly surfacing, shame. "Dad," Marcus said. His voice had lost its banquet hall quality. It was smaller, more careful. "What is?" "A 1967 Mercedes SL, Daniel said, nodding toward the cream car. "A 1971 Ferrari Daytona, a 1963 Aston Martin DB5, and a Bugatti Chiron, which I bought because I was 71 years old and I decided I had earned an indulgence." He paused. "I have a property portfolio in 3 counties. I have held stock in the same 12 companies for over 20 years. The hardware stores I built were sold in 2009 for a number that would surprise you. I am not comfortable, Marcus. Comfort is something else entirely. I am well." He let the words settle. "I have always been well." Marcus stared at him. His face was doing the thing again, cycling, searching. "I heard you last night," Daniel said, not unkindly, simply as a fact, near the bar. The shame arrived fully then. Marcus looked like a man who has just watched a recording of himself and cannot recognize the person on screen. He looked at the floor. He looked at his son sitting cross-legged in front of a Ferrari. He looked at his father, who was watching him with the patience of a person who has all the time in the world, because he has made certain that he does. "Dad, I didn't." "I know you didn't," Daniel said. "That's the part that matters most, Marcus. You didn't know because you never asked. Not once, not in 20 years. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. In the particular silence of Bay 4, with 4 extraordinary machines bearing quiet witness, they fell into the space between father and son with the weight of everything that had never been said. Oliver looked up from his spot on the floor. He was watching both of them with those clear, unhurried eyes. Marcus crossed the bay in 4 steps and did what he hadn't done at the front door of his own home the night before. He put his arms around his father, not the arms of a man managing an obligation, but the arms of someone who has just understood how close he came to losing something he didn't know he had. He held on. Daniel let him. They stayed that way for a long time. When Marcus finally stepped back, his eyes were wet in a way that had nothing to do with performance. He looked around at the cars again, and this time his expression was simple, the complexity gone out of it. He looked like someone much younger. He looked, Daniel thought, a little like the boy he had once been, before the world had convinced him that appearance was the same thing as substance. "Tell me about them," Marcus said. "The cars, tell me how you got them." Daniel looked at his son. Then he looked at Oliver, who was already nodding eagerly, drawing his knees up to his chest, settling in. "Pull up a chair," Daniel said. There were no chairs. Marcus sat on the floor beside his son. Oliver leaned against his father's shoulder with the easy naturalness of someone who loves without keeping score. Daniel stood in front of the cream-white Mercedes, the first, always the first, and he began to talk. He talked about the hardware store on Clement Street, the $11,000, the cans of soup. He talked about the first time he had seen this car, in a photograph in a magazine he'd found in a waiting room, and how he had thought, one day, not as a dream, but as a plan. He talked about the difference between a dream and a plan, which was the difference, he said, between wishing and working. Marcus listened. Oliver listened. Outside, the morning continued its business, indifferent and bright. The 4 cars sat in their quiet magnificence, not as proof of anything, but as what they had always been. Chapters in a life lived by a man who understood that the most powerful things are often the ones kept out of sight, tended in private, revealed only when the moment finally asks for them. Daniel Whitmore talked for 2 hours. His son heard, for the first time, who his father actually was. And in Bay 4 of an unremarkable storage facility on the edge of an ordinary town, something long broken was finally, carefully, being repaired. Some men spend their lives making noise to prove they exist. Others build in silence and let the work speak when it's time. Daniel had always known which kind of man he was. He had simply been waiting for his son to be ready to listen.